Hello, everybody. As we continue with evolution, it's important that we understand the main driving forces of evolution. And oftentimes you just hear the phrase natural selection. And so, what is natural selection? And this is really the process by which evolution occurs in biological organisms, right? And this is really what Darwin was trying to describe. And so there's some things that have to happen for natural selection to occur, so I just want to cover those here. So a population changing over time, how does that happen? And a lot of times we've heard survival of the fittest. Well, the fittest organisms survive. Well, yes and no. First of all, we have to address the misconception that when we're talking about fit here, in this context, we're not talking about the organisms that can lift the most weight or, some other way we think of fitness. We're talking about simply surviving and having the capacity to reproduce. So you have to have both of those components, right? You have to survive long enough to be able to reproduce to make, more offspring. So fit or fitness is really reproductive fitness. Um, do you have some traits that allow you not only to survive in the environment in which you find yourself, but to be able to reproduce and potentially pass those traits on to your offspring? So those are important criteria for natural selection to even occur. So how does it occur? Well, think about populations. We all remember those from ecology, right? We first have an organism, then we have a population, and then we get into communities and all the way up through ecosystems and the biosphere. So populations, we know, are all one species of organisms, all the same organisms, so to speak. But we've all looked at populations of organisms, whether it be insects or maybe a population of rabbits or deer or squirrels, and we know that they're not all the same, right? They have variation. They have variation in their traits in particular. Think physical phenotypes. So if we look at these ladybugs here down below, right? Some of them have big spots, some of them don't have spots. There's sort of different reds and oranges. That's the easiest one to think of, right? Physical traits. But they vary, right, from each other. And then, furthermore, if we think about, well, how do they vary? What led to those variations? Hopefully, the first thing that comes to your mind is, well, their DNA must be slightly different, right? And those variations in their DNA came from mutations over time. So, variations are neither good nor bad in and of themselves, right? A mutation is a random event that changes your DNA, that changes your protein, that changes your traits. Well, yeah, you vary. That can be a positive variation, otherwise known as an adaptation, or potentially it could be negative. If it's something that makes the organism better suited to its environment, then it's an adaptation. That variation is considered good. So, of course, think about things like behavior and shapes and colors, right? Um, if an organism is not well adapted to its environment, it dies. And of course, if it dies, it doesn't have the capacity to reproduce and pass on the traits that it has. So, anything that allows an organism to blend into its environment would be a way of thinking about an adaptation. In order to avoid predators. So you take a look at some of these organisms, right? This leaf bug and this one here, right? Having the capacity, right, to blend into an environment or to make predators think that you're something different. Those things are valuable, useful, allow you to survive. And if you survive, to give you a chance to pass on that trait potentially to your offspring. So, remember, we're not talking about one organism turning into another. So I think sometimes there's another misconception, right? That you evolve during your lifetime. Well, yeah, you might change during your lifetime, but that's not evolution, right? Evolution is more that you were born with a trait. If that trait allows you to be successful as an individual, you have potentially passed that trait on to your offspring. And over time, that impacts the makeup of a population. So, again, to just distinguish a little bit between inherited versus acquired traits, okay? Um, Inherited traits, of course, can be passed on. Think Gregor Mendel, think genetics, right? And acquired traits, things that that happen in your lifetime, don't get passed on necessarily, right? There might be a few things that could change your gametic cells that might get passed on to your offspring, but think about things like, right, if you get your ear pierced 12 times, your child's not going to be born with pierced ears, right? That's something you acquired during your lifetime. Whereas inherited, right, if your earlobe is connected, right, there's a good chance that you could pass that on to your offspring because you, in fact, inherited it. Okay, so just remember what a population looks like, right? So, of course, number 2 is a population. We have a species or an individual organism here. We have a population of that organism. And then over here, we have a community in which that organism finds itself, okay? So natural selection, really you want to think of as occurring at the population level, okay? Not on the individual, so population and up. So even communities and ecosystems can have evolution taking place, but it's occurring within and on a population. Think gene pool. Okay, so some other phrasing to be aware of. Descent with modification, and this was in the video I showed you last week. Each species has evolved from common ancestors, and we're going to build some phylogenetic trees later on in this unit. Natural selection is causing evolution from that common ancestor, right? So a ancestor or population of ancestors, right, maybe gets fragmented, split up somehow by a river or a canyon, or one's on an island and one ends up on the shore of the mainland, right? These organisms now have different natural forces impacting them. So, some things that need to be in place for evolution to occur. I think these are all fairly intuitive, but these are sort of the 4 postulates of evolution. First of all, you have to have variation in traits. If every organism is the same, right, then nature will likely act on them all the same. And side note, that's one of the problems with monocultures, right? When we make clones of certain types of organisms, if there's a drought and every single organism is the same and they're all susceptible to drought, they're all going to die, right? Whereas if we have populations that vary in their traits, right, so some plants can handle drought better than others, and we have a variation rather than a monoculture, well, now some of those organisms will survive the drought, some will not. And remember, any variation in an organism comes from genetics, right? Changes in the genome of an organism. If those traits are beneficial, they're adaptations, then they might offer reproductive advantages, right? If you can live long enough to reproduce, you have a good chance of passing those traits on, those genotypes on to your own offspring. Okay, the second postulate is that traits are inherited. And this, again, is pretty intuitive. We know this. Traits that we have received from our parents can be passed on to our offspring. And then finally, the third and fourth postulates for evolution to occur in nature is that you have to have enough offspring produced that natural selection can occur on a population. And so often more offspring are produced than can survive. So nature acts on some of them, right? Imagine a bird coming along and starting eating those bugs, right, on the left there, those insects on the left. right? Some of them are going to live, some aren't. And will it be based on the characteristics of those organisms? Well, then evolution is occurring within that population. So finally, and again, this is essentially just stating how natural selection works, organisms with advantageous traits, right, adaptations, will survive. And if they reproduce, right, evolution has occurred in that population. Okay, that's all for now. I'm going to have you do a simulation of peppered moths here soon. Hope everybody's well.